On paper, Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark has it all. A director, Andre Overdahl, well known for a creepy, good movie, The Autopsy of Jane Doe. A producer, renowned worldwide for his monsters and creative design, that's Guillermo del Toro. And of course, well-known, well-liked source material that's heavy on the nostalgia factor. Unfortunately, none of this makes the film itself good. Let's find out why. Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark is set firmly in 1968, with the Vietnam conflict heavy on people's minds and Nixon running for president. In the middle of all this is spooky stories fanatic Stella and her gang of teen mates. After running into a charismatic stranger, the gang head out to a haunted house and find a book full of grisly stories. But the book holds a dark secret, and as its stories turn into real life, Stella and co put their lives on the line to uncover a deeply buried mystery. If you've been paying attention, you might recognize this story because it's in basically every teen horror movie. A bunch of teens go into a haunted house and discover there's some truth behind the urban legends there. Whoop-de-doo, so far so familiar. Now, one of the advantages of having a very familiar, I would call it cliche, but the filmmakers might have called it archetypal story setup, is that it allows you to familiarize the audience with what's going on very quickly and then really get into the meat of the movie. But this film does the opposite. It takes forever in its setup when we all know where it's going. Any horror film watcher will know what's going to happen in the film. I think anyone who's only really familiar with horror from parodies of horror, who's never actually watched a horror film, will be able to work out what's going on quite quickly. And this is a recurring thing throughout the film. It happens in all of the monster attacks. It's much, much clearer to us what's happening than it is to the characters, and so it's kind of dull to watch them work it out. But also in the thematic work in the film as well. I mentioned that it's set in 1968, and that is a non-trivial piece of information because the film wants to make very, very sure that you know that it's set in 1968. People constantly talk about Nixon, and we actually see slices of election coverage from when Nixon got elected. We also see a lot of stuff about Vietnam. We see newsreel footage and people having conversations about it and people getting drafted. In fact, it ends up being quite important in the story. But none of it really goes anywhere, and it's hard to work out exactly why there's this focus on that element of the film. My best guess is that Overdahl is trying to make a reference to the kind of political violence of the age and how that affected people who are the same age as the kids in the film. But that seems like a really big step to take for a film that really isn't that interested in telling that story. It's really just telling this supernatural story separately to that. It doesn't help that the characters themselves are quite recognizable archetypal tropes. We have this mysterious but kind of a fitty stranger who drifts into the movie. We have Stella herself, who's a bookish teen with hidden depths, who finds her own strength over the course of the film. And then in the friends, we have this neurotic goody two-shoes guy who's kind of sweet and has some crushes on some of the girls. And we have this more puerile character, a kind of Jonah Hill in Superbad type guy. And of course he has a stuck-up older sister who's dating the secretly psychotic jock. Now again, there is an advantage to having characters like that. These recognizable tropes allow filmmakers to riff on those characters and create really interesting, fun character interactions. I think about Paranorman in this, where the jock older brother of one of the main characters ends up being a really funny and quite subversive character in the film. These filmmakers aren't interested in doing that, and in fact, most of the teens don't live long enough for us to get any kind of depth explored in their characters. But then this is a horror, and I can forgive a weak plot and some poor characterization if there are really good scares and good monster designs in the film. So what about those wonderful monsters who are drawn from those illustrations that everyone remembers from the source material books? The illustrations that quite likely was what drew Guillermo del Toro's interest into this project. What about those monsters? The long and short of it is that the monsters are the best thing about the film. By taking the decision to adapt several stories from the books, because they're all quite short, the filmmakers have 4 or 5 different distinct monsters that really have their own feel and their own look. These are the moments where the film comes to life, where Overdahl becomes quite playful and the color palettes change, the camera does interesting things, and right in the middle of it are these fantastic creature designs. They're mostly prosthetics with a little bit of CGI to aid, and they are really cool looking. But they're not scary. If I was going to describe my overall emotion around those sequences, it would be grossed out. Probably free of the major scare sequences, and I hesitate to call them that because they really aren't scary, are more gross than they are terrifying. We have spiders crawling out of someone's face. We have a very desiccated corpse crawling through a house. We have a guy being forcibly transformed into a scarecrow. All very imaginative, all very gross, but not very scary. And unfortunately, that's what the film comes down to. The monsters are fun, clever, and well conceived. The rest of the movie just isn't. And it's all just glaringly familiar. I couldn't quite put my finger on it until near the end of the film, but this plot is really weirdly similar to the plot of the Goosebumps film that came out in 2015. There's a gang of kids who go to a haunted house, find a magic book, stories out of that book become true, and they're both adaptations of famous kids' books that take several characters from the series and then turn it into one joint narrative. So I had some hopes for this film, and they were kind of dashed. The film itself really isn't that interesting. The best outcome I can imagine for this film is that it will be used by teens, 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds even, at sleepovers to introduce themselves and their friends to horror. The nice thing about the film is that it's structured like a horror, but it isn't that scary. It's kind of gross, and it also has lots of boring character sections which people can just talk over. If you're bored of Hocus Pocus, but you're not quite ready yet for Halloween, then this film is probably a nice middle ground. And I think that's an interesting outcome for the movie. Whether or not that's what the filmmakers intended is very hard to say, and I'm not particularly interested in finding out. As ever, I'd love to hear about what you thought in this movie in the comments below, especially because I know a lot of people who watch the channel are real horror buffs. That's it from me. Have a good one. Bye for now.